My guest this hour is Rebekah Koffler. She is the author of the new book, Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America. The book was released last Tuesday, and we talk about Putin and Russia and the U.S.-Russian relations. But probably just as important is our conversation about her life in Russia and how that shapes her view of America and gives her a clear understanding of the dangers of the path our culture is going down now. Here is the first segment of our interview.
Rebekah, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Charles.
So your new book, which was released this past Tuesday, Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America. What prompted you to write the book?
Well, I wanted to provide a warning to Americans about the true Russian threat, not the various politicized theories and conspiracy hoaxes, but the true threat posed to us by the Russian President Putin and his master plan to weaken America.
It sounds really important. Obviously, we'll get some things from the book that most people don't already know. And we'll get into Putin and the things you wrote about. But first, I think we need to set the groundwork here. You were born and raised in the USSR. I won't even say Russia when you were coming up. And so I want to kind of talk about that from the beginning and ask you what it was like growing up behind the Iron Curtain.
It was very different than growing up in America, because I see my children growing up here, they're American born. And I'll tell you, every day I remind them that you kids have no idea how lucky you are, how blessed you are to live in the most wonderful country in the world, the land of freedom and the land of justice. When I was growing up, like you said, behind the Iron Curtain, I lived under socialism, which is a totalitarian government regime. Socialism is basically destructive. Under socialism, everybody is equally poor and everybody is a subject to the government. Whatever government wants, you are supposed to obey and do. So there were lots of shortages, there was hardly enough food. I just recently wrote an article for Fox News called US.0. My adopted homeland is giving me a flashback to Russia, which I fled 30 years ago, where I basically discussed all the alarming trends, in my view, that are happening right now in the United States. And I am really concerned about where this country is going, because socialism is destructive. I do not want my children to grow up in similar conditions that I did and experience the horror movie that socialism is.
Well, this is going to be a really interesting episode for listeners. They're going to love this. I don't necessarily plan these things like this. They just work out based on when I book the interviews. But in the previous hour, I had Lily Tang Williams on, and she, similar to you in the sense that she's concerned that she fled communist China. And when I asked her about her childhood and what it was like, she grew up there as well. It's not like she came to America when she was 3 or 4. I think she was in her 20s. And she paints a similar picture, both of the struggles, the government watching you, the things you need to be afraid to say and do. And you talk about that with the warnings your parents gave you. So those were similar. Yet you were in Russia. She was in China. Not necessarily the same, but it's amazing. And I bet if you talk to immigrants from all over the world, they have similar stories. Why they came here, what they left, and what they came here hoping America would be what they had heard about. And sometimes it met or exceeded their expectations, only to find now that they've been here 10, 20, 30 years, to seeing us regressing to what they were afraid of. You hear Cubans talk about this. I have friends from Africa talk about this. So, it's great that this whole episode today will be a warning, just like you were given a warning on Russia specifically, but it's a greater warning. It's a warning on what America means to the world and what is happening to America and being seen through somebody who immigrated here.
Yes, Americans truly don't understand what socialism is, because it sounds wonderful. I mean, who wouldn't want a bunch of free stuff, right? Who wouldn't want some help. We all know that sometimes, you could struggle, paying your mortgage or your child's tuition. And if somebody offers it to you for free, of course. But what happens actually, if you do that structurally, if you change the system and you basically redistribute wealth, what happens in the end, wealth creation stops. Just imagine, why would anybody like Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk or any of those people who have created tremendous innovation in this country? And it is this country that produces these revolutionary, marvels as, let's say, Amazon, right? We love and hate Amazon for various reasons. But just think about that. Anything that you wish can get delivered to you within 2 days or even the same day. So who would want to A, invest in those types of creations, and B, really work hard? Because no one I know who makes, a lot of money makes it by being lazy. So they wouldn't want knowing that the fruits of their labor is going to be appropriated by the government, who's going to misuse it. And we all know how, government treats other people's money, right? Nobody's going to do that. And eventually what happens, socialism produces these wonders that capitalism produces. And then everybody's level of income and lifestyle really drops, and you become equally poor. That's what equality really means, Charles.
But it's not just the economy. It's not just what you can buy and that you can build a business and all that stuff is great as Americans. But there's also another piece. A lot of in Russia, you describe it in your book. Lily talked about it in China. The thumb of the government. You are part of the state. The state dictates everything. There's surveillance. There's people being arrested for not saying and thinking the right things. There's misinformation coming from the government, things of that nature. So there's a difference in the freedoms. Really, that's really people come for the opportunity and the freedoms. And you had an interesting set of parents. You say that in the book that you grew up in an anti-communist family. So what was it like being living with parents who understood as a child what was going on and how they disseminated that information of what you needed to be concerned about? And why did your mother want you to come to America so early in your childhood?
So, Charles, I answer the second question first because it's easier. I don't know why my mother wanted me to come. And I cannot ask, unfortunately, because my mother died back in 1993, courtesy of the wonderful free socialist healthcare. So unfortunately, I cannot ask her. My sister and I, who are both here in America, always wonder why that is. How did she know? So that's the real question. But somehow she knew. My suspicion is that maybe she knew because we, as you said, my parents were against the system, against the communist system. We listened surreptitiously, Voice of America and Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe, and through our shortwave radios, and we heard about life in America. And so that's probably how she knew. It wasn't easy growing up with your parents telling you one thing and school telling you another. Sometimes I just felt very confused because as a child, you really, sometimes can't pick up these nuances. And there comes a point as a teenager when you believe others more than you believe your own parents. So just like my children right now, when I tell them about the Marxist, theory and this whole critical race theory that's being pushed down their throats, and I tell them that they should not believe it, I also, wondered whether my parents were correct or whether the school teachers were correct. And my mom, every day leaving out of the door to go to school, she told us 3 admonitions to me and my sister. First, do not believe everything your teachers teach you. Second, do not believe everything that you see and hear on TV and radio. And third, do not share with everyone your family's views. And I say the same thing right now to my kids, Charles.
Coming up, more with Rebekah Koffler, author of Putin's Playbook. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
We return to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer. Once again, here's Charles Love.
Are you tired of summer nights in May?
Welcome back. I'm continuing my conversation with Rebekah Koffler, author of the new book, Putin's Playbook. And in this segment, we talk about Russia, some interesting things about the Russian people that you don't hear that often, and get some insight into Russians and, in that way, Putin. And we also talk about education and the lack of knowledge the American kids have about Russia and any other country, and we kind of talk about why that is.
One thing I want to do, as we get closer to the Putin and the Russia issue, we're setting it up. So you explain what it was like there. The next phase is you studied English there because your mom wanted you to come here. But you grew up there, you went to university there, you understand the way Russian people think and the way Putin thinks. So even before we get to that, people need to understand this. I like the parts of the book most that give people a picture of what they think they know, but they don't really know. And in it, you talk both about how most Russians view Russia and obviously, by extension, Putin. And I found this piece pretty interesting. You say, Russians are an enormously proud people. They inhabit the world's largest country, spanning 11 time zones and teeming with vast natural resources. Russians sent the first satellite and first human into space, invented the periodic table of elements, gave to the world the Nutcracker and Swan Lake ballets, and created some of the world's most profound literature, love Dostoevsky. And having sacrificed 20 million people in World War II, more than any other nation, here's one of the interesting parts. Russia also views itself as the world's leader against fascism. I don't think that most Americans thought of Russia that way.
Well, that's the thing. I don't understand why. Well, right now, the schools, from what I can tell, don't teach much about Russia at all. And then probably during the Cold War, everything that was taught was one-sided. Capitalism and freedom versus communism and unfreedom, so to speak. So I honestly don't know why Americans, it kind of perplexing to me as well, why a student in school would not know that Mendeleev's table was, invented by a Russian and things like that. But that needs to happen. And I think we need to make a distinction between the oppressive Soviet, socialist, and communist government regime and actually the Russian people. The Russians don't think like Americans. It's true. But the people themselves are not the threat. It is the government.
I can give you a hint. It's because we're so focused on race. See, this is what I'm proud of. Earlier, you used the word nuance, and I talk about the culture a lot, and I love that because I love history. This battle of CRT is, they don't want to teach Black history. I want to teach all the history. But the problem is, just like if you only want to teach the negative of America, or in your case, you're so focused on America that you don't teach what happened anywhere else, we become a society that is behind everyone else, because everywhere else in the world, they're teaching you everything because they don't have that strain of bias that obviously they're going to say, we're going to teach what's great about our country, but they don't have a problem with teaching about America because America's that beacon on the hill. But Americans are like, let's just learn about slavery and what happened here and then not learn all this other stuff. So I think that it's doing us a disservice in another way. So we talk about how the race talk is bad because it pits one side to the other, which is true. But it's also a problem because it limits. It's only so many hours in a day, and it limits what you can teach. So when you do that, now we don't get to learn all the wonderful things about Russia or India or China or anywhere else because we're so focused on who was the evil white guy in 1846. But you write another piece that's interesting. You talk about them being a divinely inspired civilization and believing they have imperial exceptionalism and they were the third Rome. But at the same time, these are all positive, strong things. but at the same time, they are anti-individualism. They're subordinate to the state. And the fact that Stalin is still popular there is interesting because it makes them like almost half like Americans and half like, the Western thinking as far as strength and power and love of country and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, they're diametrically opposed.
Right. And that is sort of the conundrum and the nuance that is not easy to understand the Westerners. So basically there's this inferiority complex almost. On the one hand, the Russians believe that they are an exceptional and a superior nation, sort of akin to the Americans' feeling of exceptionalism, right? But the Americans rather believe that the source of strength is individualism, an individual, and the Russians believe that their strength is in collectivism versus individualism. And who is creating the collective? It's the government. And the government control, they believe, is necessary to ensure the security and safety of the country, because the country is so vast. Traditionally, Russia has fielded very strong military, and it relied for its vast land and specifically the strategic security perimeter, which is the former Soviet states, to protect itself, right? And this is why right now there's a standoff between the United States and Russia, specifically because Putin wants to restore that strategic security perimeter. And in contrast to that, it has been a long-standing U.S. policy to, quote-unquote, democratize countries like Ukraine, Belarus, Georgia, and therefore we are in this conflict. And that's why I wrote the book, is to warn why this conflict is brewing. And in fact, Putin and his national security apparatus believe a war between our two countries is inevitable.
And the last question before we get to more specifics on Putin and the relations with Russia is, how did you end up working at the DIA?
After September 11th, I was very motivated to serve because I saw my adopted country, the United States, under attack from terrorism. And I was just, I was on the one hand terrified, on the other hand appalled at how can anybody dare to attack this country. And I realized how much misunderstanding there is, in other parts of the world about what America is all about. There are all these, theories, how it's an imperialist country, and that's because they just didn't know anything about America. So, George Bush, Jr., the former president, put out a call on first-generation Americans to go into the government and help, understand other mindsets of foreign cultures. And so I wanted to serve, and I started applying for intelligence jobs. And it took me years to actually get in. And it was almost 7 years before I set my foot through the door of the Defense Intelligence Agency, because someone with my background, has to go such an incredible, convoluted, complex, and lengthy security clearance process, much longer than a regular American, a born American. I'm a naturalized citizen, not a born U.S. citizen. And so ironically, the more you understand about foreign countries, the less likely you're to get in the intelligence community, because it's so difficult. And the government bureaucrats would rather pick someone up with a 2 or 3 page, security clearance form, the SF-86, than 76 pages. You know what I mean? Because it's much easier and they don't want to do the work. And that's what happens. What ends up happening is we have people who have no competence in their area of study. and they make decisions and policies and intelligence assessment that end up being faulty, just like the intelligence assessment that the community put out in 2017 that assessed that the Russians prefer Trump over Hillary Clinton. That could be nothing further from the truth. It's wrong, but that's because of the misunderstanding of the intelligence, because it is interpreted while mirror imaging. We have this term mirror imaging. When you don't understand the adversary's mindset, you project your own, framework and how you think. But the Russians don't think like Americans. Neither do the Afghans, neither do the Iraqis. And so we are in this mess right now.
Coming up, more with Rebekah Koffler, author of Putin's Playbook. You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
You're listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Rebekah Koffler, former Defense Intelligence Agency officer and author of the new book, Putin's Playbook. And we've been talking about her life behind the Iron Curtain and her intricate knowledge of Russia. But here I want to get to the book. It's called Putin's Playbook. So I simply ask her, what is Putin's secret plan and how is it orchestrated?
So the plan consists of a range of what I would call tools that include both military and non-military means. In terms of the military means, it is a whole range of weapons, both conventional weapons and nuclear weapons. In terms of non-military, it's something that the Russians call asymmetric, and that includes cyber, space, and other measures such as intimidations and assassinations and all kinds of things that are unique to Russian spycraft. It's called active measure. Just a couple of examples on that. An example of an active measure would be Russia's interference in U.S. 2016 presidential elections and then subsequent, to other elections, albeit not for the same purpose, for the purpose that the intelligence community assessment stated, not to prop up Trump, not to place Trump in the office, but to sow discord and to destabilize the society. Another example of these special measures would be Russian energy weapons against our diplomats. Recently, we've had a case in Vienna, Austria, which is basically the hotbed of spying, and our officials experienced debilitating symptoms that are consistent with something that has been dubbed the Havana syndrome because it originated in Cuba, Havana. And the symptoms range from dizziness to vertigo all the way to brain damage. So these are just some of the examples. And the cyber warfare that we see right now is only the tip of the iceberg. So my book reveals the rest of the iceberg and Putin's master plan. It's too big for me to get into every detail on the show, but this is just sort of the basic picture.
Right, and they need to read the book to get the rest anyway. I've had on the show a couple times Peter Price, the executive director of the Task Force on National and Homeland Security, and we talked about the cyber attacks. And so, we've had a couple long conversations about that, and it's a pretty bad thing and pretty detailed what these countries can do, not just Russia, North Korea, China. Why do we here in the media talk so little about it? And why is the government so woefully prepared for it?
It's a puzzle to me, Charles, also. So the government is unprepared because partially because of what I described, because there are a lot of deficiencies in terms of the actual competence to assess properly your intelligence target. Because you have people, yes, there are a handful of people who do speak the language, have lived in the country, understand the target, can look at the intelligence report and make an assessment based on their understanding of thinking of the target, right? But many people just simply are not able to do that. And they do that, because intelligence does not come in the English language, right? We collect it through various methods and sources, through satellites, through, conversation intercepts, through taking picture of military installations, by debriefing actual agents and spies. So you have to be able to do it in their language, right? So that's one of the reasons, is because we have very limited expertise. And another reason is that, believe it or not, intelligence reports that go in the PDB, that go to senior officials, are driven by the news cycle, right? It's whatever, and I call that intelligence an oop-de-doo intelligence. You get a report, North Korean, president, just burped. I'm just trying to make a joke, right? And you write that up. And so that what goes in. Something like doctrine and strategy, which is, how does a country fight a war, right? Because countries don't fight wars the same way that we do. We are a technologically superior country. So, and ironically, they figured that out. So what they've done in Afghanistan, they created IEDs, which is a low cost, way of maiming our troops. And so we're pulling out of there without having been able to actually establish victory solidly. So that is the reason. So the government does not go about looking at intelligence and creating a viable policy based on that intelligence, because it is unable to.
Coming up, more with Rebekah Koffler, author of Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America. You are listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
Now, more of The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer, with your host, Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Rebekah Koffler, author of Putin's Playbook, and we continue our conversation about Putin, his plan of attack, and his willingness to use multiple avenues to attack America. And here we talk about some of those things that go beyond cyber attacks or military actions, the things he can do without firing a weapon.
Well, the interesting thing you mentioned earlier was that we are superior in many ways militarily. So countries don't attack us the same way. And we are, as the government, probably a little hubris. We're too proud to understand the impact and the power that they can do in other ways. You talk about one really interesting and important piece we have to spend time on in the book. And that is that while Putin's obviously willing to attack his opponent, you say in the book that he is subverting America from within and doesn't have to really fire a weapon. And you talk about his 4-stage program. Talk about that a bit, the Marxism, equality of outcome, intolerance, and rejection of religion, and how it's working so well.
Right. So, yes, Russian intelligence services and the military apparatus perform what is called their own intelligence assessment and forecast. And they have, we are superior technologically and militarily, and therefore they fear a kinetic conflict. So what they have decided is that an asymmetric strategy would be a more viable strategy to undermine America. What does that mean? They decided that they're going to wage this conflict below the threshold of military response. It is so-called controlled instability strategy, controlled instability, right? And this is why we see these cyber attacks we see disinformation. And the intent is to, pit the various groups of Americans, religious, ethnic, racial, political, against one another, and make them fight each other. Create these shortages that we saw with gasoline and with meat, and there are more attacks coming, I'm certain of it, and plunge the society into chaos, eventually degrade its, various supplies of food reserves, gasoline reserves, and create discord, create unhappiness. And we see the results of that. And this sort of program, actually, as you pointed out, Charles, the 4-step program, it existed for a long time, for decades. Soviets were the first one to create this program, and a defector named Yuri Bezmenov, who was debriefed by the CIA, warned us about that. And unfortunately, we did not heed his advice. So the program is in 4 steps. Basically, it's a brainwashing type of strategy where you promulgate Marxist ideology, everyone is equal, and you place your own indoctrinated people into government institutions, into schools, and eventually the strategy pays dividend. You plant the seeds and you get a tree, so to speak, and eventually the government apparatus is infested with the leftist-minded people who don't even understand what they are promulgated, the danger of what they promulgate.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that he can just sit back and we're just falling right into the trap and giving him exactly what he wants. Well, I guess the last question I want to ask about this is, what do you think the most important thing is that Americans need to know about Russia, or some myth that they believe that is not true?
Well, the first myth that is not true that I would like to emphasize is that the 2016 election interference, which was called by some U.S. security officials the most sophisticated, most successful covert influence operation in the history of covert influence operations. It was not about electing Trump, because this is going to happen again, and I don't want the similar disinformation be spread and our country being torn apart, right? The second thing that happened was our corrupt intelligence officials at the upper echelons took that myth and ran with it based on, they were taking this Steele dossier, which is effectively was Russian disinformation, and they spread that lie through the media, through everywhere, and deceived the American people because they wanted to, prevent Trump from becoming president, and then later when he did, to unseat him. So that is the biggest lie. And so if that happens again, which I'm sure Russians are going to try to interfere again, people just need to understand Russia is nonpartisan in its anti-American strategy.
Right. They're just anti-American.
They hate Hillary, they hate Biden. They're going to do everything to undermine us and to destabilize and subvert our country. That's what I want people to know.
Coming up, my final segment with Rebekah Koffler, former Defense Intelligence Agency officer and author of the new book, Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America. You are listening to The Charles Love Show on AM 560, The Answer.
The Charles Love Show continues on AM 560, The Answer. Here's Charles Love.
Welcome back. I am continuing my conversation with Rebekah Koffler, former Defense Intelligence Agency officer and author of the new book, Putin's Playbook. And here's the final segment of our interview.
And another thing I wanted to quickly point out is that people will find it interesting that parts of your book they're missing. Talk about the DIA
yes,
redacting your thoughts, and they're already trying to stop you from warning us.
Right. Well, that's another thing that is giving me a flashback into the USSR, because censorship is the hallmark of totalitarian regimes. Russia, China, it's un-American. So what happened was, as a former intelligence officer, I had to submit my manuscript for review to the government, to my former agency, DIA, and they reviewed it forever. Okay. So it's a legitimate process to ensure that secrets are kept secret. But unfortunately, the government frequently misuses this process. And in my case, they weaponize this process to censor my book, to really prevent Americans from knowing the truth. There's some information that they deleted that they don't want Americans to know because, I provided a warning that the government is unable to counteract Putin's plan. And we see that right now, President Biden has not responded forcefully to Russia's cyber war. He kept saying how he's not going to allow it, how he's going to protect us. None of that happened. And that's because they just don't know how. We have the capability, but the concern is that it's going to escalate Putin's action even further and cripple our economy. But in order for that not to happen, you need to know which targets to hit. You need to understand how they rank their targets. So the government also did not want people to see all the criticism that I included in the book and some other information. Obviously, I can't go into detail. So they delayed, and we even missed our publication date. Some books delayed for 5 years. At the same time, the books by James Comey, John Brennan, James Clapper came out so fast. So it's usually the people who are there to tell the truth to Americans that get targeted by this pre-publication review process in order for the government to censor information that it doesn't want Americans to know. And I disputed that. They tried to censor me, but I will not be silenced. I appreciate that you have me on the show so that I can tell Americans the truth, and they will be able to know Putin's plan, and they'll be able to help fight it and put pressure on our government to develop a viable counter strategy and stop just sitting around and not fight back.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, but just know that the book is full of great information. I enjoyed it. And in spite of the redacting, it's still a great read. She is Rebekah Koffler, former DIA intelligence officer and author of Putin's Playbook, Russia's Secret Plan to Defeat America. And another note, if for nothing else, you buy the book, and if you read the epilogue and find out why she's a former DIA intelligence officer, that will be a gripping story. It may be another book in itself. Rebekah, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Charles.